Hello. So thanks very much for the introduction, Sue. As you mentioned, I'm Ben Harris-Roxas. I won't rehash what you've already heard, but I thought it'd be nice to be able to put a face to the name. As you mentioned, I've been using NVivo for more than a decade now. So this is NVivo 2, what it used to look like. And so even though it's changed a lot since then, a lot of the core functionality is the same. So, you know, NVivo's been really an important tool in my research for a long time now. What I'm hoping to cover today are 6 points, really. The basics of Evernote, how you select and organize that information in Evernote, and then using it on the go, how to get your data from Evernote into NVivo, which is an important step, common questions that I've encountered from people, and some tips for how I think it can be useful. What's important to note is that we won't be focusing on how you analyze the data once you get it into NVivo. There's lots of products and training sessions from QSR that tackle that really well. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge Lynn Lavery from Academic Consultant did a session on Evernote and NVivo last year that's really worth checking out, and the recording's available. I've included the link at the end. What's really interesting is in the 15 months or so since that session, there's a lot of new features and capabilities that exist in both Evernote and NVivo. So, and particularly considering the next release of NVivo Suite, the landscape's changing, and I think we've got some really useful and powerful functionality coming into both products. So before we begin though, you're probably wondering what's the problem that Evernote solves. So in the context of qualitative research, Evernote allows you to collect and, I guess, store all your data in one place. And the thing that I love is you always have your data with you. You can't lose it in the way that you can a notebook or a, you know, I've lost digital recorders out in the field before and it's been a minor disaster. This is a way around some of those challenges. I think it's a useful tool. I wouldn't like to pretend that there aren't some trade-offs that you make in using it though, and we'll cover those later on. So looking forward to getting into it. I think the other thing that's really important to note is that there are some complementary approaches. NVivo's got an excellent extension called nCapture that lets you save web content into NVivo, and that's a really useful tool and add-on, and has some of the functions that I use Evernote for. OneNote's a product that's developed by Microsoft that's got some quite similar functionality, and I think both are really useful tools. But what sets Evernote apart for me is the range of platforms it's on and the range of features it has. I think the other thing that's worth keeping in mind at the moment is that NVivo 11 is coming out soon, and that's got some really interesting additional capabilities such as the social network structure analysis and different visualizations. And so it's worth keeping that in mind, that if you're thinking of using Evernote to collect data from social media, well, a lot of that's already baked into NVivo and will be increasingly so in future editions. I'll be using examples today from screen caps on Windows, Mac and iOS devices because they're what I use on a day-to-day basis, but there's equivalents for Evernote products on other platforms like Android and Windows Phone. So even though I'm focused on those, you can get it on other platforms as well. So it's worth covering a few of the basics of Evernote before we get stuck in. The first thing to note is what is Evernote? And in essence, it's a notes program with a bunch of add-ons. So it's a fancy notes program. It takes that notes concept and extends it by allowing you to embed a range of different attachments. So the core concepts underpinning it and its use are these notes. So these are files that can contain text and a range of attachments. So that includes images, web pages, audio, scanned in notes and handwritten notes, something that I use it for quite a lot, and other objects. So what's important to note is that it can have multiple attachments within an individual note, and I think if I recall correctly, it can be up to 100 megabytes in size, but that's often changing. They're extending the capability of it and so on, so that the notes can get bigger in size. So notebooks are collections of notes, so similar to folders. And the other thing to note is that you can tag notes. So that's attributes that you can give to a note, and each note can have as many tags as you like, essentially. But what is really useful at a practical level is syncing. So what that means is that information on Evernote, if I create it on my desktop computer, it'll be on my phone. If I update it on my phone, the revised version will be on my computer. That syncing functionality works quite well and is really important in the context of using Evernote for field work, I find. The thing that's important to note is it's got a free version and a subscription version. Really the most important difference between the free and the subscription versions are the amount of data you're allowed to upload in a month. So I think the free version limits you to a moderately small amount of information, say 60 or 100 megabytes a month. But that's enough to get started. And I think, experiment and see if Evernote works for you. So how do you actually use it? Here's a screen cap of a project I've created. So I've created a folder, Evernote NVivo for today, based around, I guess, a dummy concept around commuting. And I've created a range of notes using different types of, attaching different types of information, so there's some scanned-in notes, there's some clipped information from websites, there's some PDFs and so on. So this is what it looks like on the website. So that's the notebook that it sits in, is Evernote NVivo. On the right-hand side is what a note looks like. In this case, it's a scanned version of a page. But there's other ways of accessing it. There's desktop apps, so this is what it looks like on a map. Very similar structure and look to the website. The main difference that's worth noting is that your notes can be available offline, and it's got the ability to record audio built into the app. This is what it looks like on a Windows operating system. There's also a range of apps available for mobile phones, and we'll get some samples of what that looks like as we get to it. And the good thing about the app sits on your tablet or your phone is that it's got the features like recording audio, being able to integrate video, and inserting photos that you've taken on your phone. This on screen is what they call a web clipper, so it's similar to the nCapture that I mentioned at the beginning. It's something it's a browser add-on that lets you save pages into Evernote. So we'll get into this in a little bit more detail. There are some other useful features actually that I think might be worth mentioning that can be helpful when you're doing qualitative research, in that you can attach reminders to each note, which is really helpful if you're in the field and you think, I need to come back to this or think about this in a week. So you can set a reminder and that'll pop up at the specified time. Sharing notes and notebooks can be helpful, so you can send a link to your colleagues if you want to say this is the information I'm sharing, and they can see it and check it in more or less real time. And there's a functionality called Work Chat, which is a chat function within Evernote that allows you to collaborate and so on. I won't be going into those in detail, but they're worth keeping in the back of your mind. So that brings us to the second point about how do you actually collect and organize your data in Evernote. So as I mentioned, I've created a dummy project about commuting to give you a sense of what's possible in Evernote. And this is what the notebook looks like, as we discussed. You can see on the right-hand side I've just created a new note. So that's essentially a very blank field at this stage. Notes are straightforward to create. You can just type in some text, and simple formatting is possible, as you see, and you can embed objects in it. The other thing that quite a useful way of collecting information I find is every Evernote account comes with an email address, so you can forward emails into it, you can send emails to yourself. So it's a great way for creating quick notes, and that's worth keeping in mind. And the emails can include attachments as well. So as you'll notice on this screen, up in the top right-hand corner, there's a Save to Evernote button. So that's actually something that exists in Microsoft Outlook that's similar to the web clipper, and it lets you save an email directly into your Evernote as well. So that's a useful tool that's worth mentioning. Clipping websites is straightforward, but there's some quite useful features that I think lend itself quite well to collecting data that you then analyze in NVivo. So this is taking one approach to using the web clipper. It gives you a range of options for how you can clip the information as the full article with the formatting as it appears on the page, and the plus and minus arrow at the top of the screen you can see lets you expand or reduce the areas that you collect. So in this case, it's just collecting that single tweet. It's not collecting all the information and the responses that sit underneath. You can also select simplified article, and I think that's a good tip actually, is that for NVivo, the simplified article actually comes across in a slightly simplified format, and it actually makes it easier to strips out some of the unnecessary formatting and makes it easier to code in NVivo, so that's something to keep in mind. It's also, and this slide is an example of what happens if you clip it as an image. And the other thing to note is that it gives you the option on the right-hand side to annotate images as well, so that can be helpful depending on the purpose of the information that you're clipping. If you need to get the layout and everything perfectly, then maybe an image is the way to gather it. It's also possible to do that clipping process on your phone as well. And hopefully this will work. I did a little video of actually saving a page to Evernote on the iPad, and this is how it works. If the internet will cooperate, it can be quite useful to just see the steps involved. It's really quite straightforward. We press that button, it shows up as an option, and we select where it goes, we switch to the app, and we can see it's shown up already. So it's really quite straightforward to clip things not only on your desktop but also on your phone or tablet. So now this is a particular piece of magic that I will play this video if it's alright, if you'll bear with us and the temperamental connection that we can have off YouTube, is that Evernote lets you scan in handwritten notes, not just as an image, but it also does recognition of the handwritten notes, and this is one of my favourite things. So I'll just give you a sense of how it works in practice. You go to your app on your tablet or your phone, create a new note, select the Take Photo option, and I've put my handwritten notebook note in front of me. Here it is trying to recognise the page, capturing. There's a little bit of thinking time while it actually does the OCR on the page, and then it saves it there. So we save the note, and it's in Evernote. Now, the thing that's really great to note about that is that you can do a search afterwards. So here I've done a search through my notes afterwards for concepts, and it's recognised even my appalling handwriting. So I think that's really a powerful functionality, and for those of us who do like to do some of our thinking and journaling in handwritten form, in a written journal, it's really just a nice feature and helps to identify and help you go back and find some of those concepts that otherwise can be quite hard to track down in written your written journals and so on. Of course, one of the most important things that we're always doing as qual researchers is interviewing people, recording audio, that sort of thing. Now, the Evernote app has an inbuilt sound recorder that works really well and lets you embed audio into notes, and actually it can work simultaneously, so you can take notes and record at the same time. But the caveat I'd have is that I've had a few occasions where maybe the battery's run out or the app's crashed and the recording has been lost. So one thing to mention is that that's the only situation in which I've encountered where I can lose data. If I've brought a file across otherwise, I've never encountered the issue of losing information. It's just that recording and then saving it in the file format that can sometimes encounter problems. So what I would actually recommend is recording the information using another app. So here's an example of I use an app called Recordium, saving a little bit of audio. Save the file there because that gives you a recording that you can be confident safe. You can save it in other formats, export it in various ways, one of which is Evernote. So here I selected the, oh no, and we've got the sound of me as well, so I'll just mute that. That's just me trying to create a sample bit of audio, and I've selected Save in Evernote, and there it shows up. So that's, I think, a good practice. I've also included an example later on of how does it work when you actually save it in the NVivo app. You see that wobbly line up the top is just telling you that, yeah, it is recording audio, and then it saves directly into it. So they're both really useful ways, I think, of collecting audio on the go. The thing that I'd like to mention is that you can do a similar process with saving video files within Notes. I would say this is a functionality that exists, but be a little bit wary of it for similar reasons to saving audio. Evernote isn't the greatest format at saving large files. So what I'd actually recommend is that you save your videos using your native phone capability, if it's the video recording app that's built into your phone and so on, and find where it's saved. Then use a second-party app like I have, a third-party app I should say, that allows you to compress the file a little bit. So this is an app called Video Slimmer that I use, and that, once it's been compressed, you can see it takes even just a few seconds of video, reduced it from 27 megabytes down to just 1.5, and it lets me save in there. Now, I'd caution you that just because it's not great for those huge files, if you are using video, there's probably better ways to store and retain it, but it is a useful functionality, and you can often save a smaller version of the file into your NVivo, into your Evernote, I should say, so that you're able to at least refer to it and look at it and see what the information in it is. But yeah, that cautionary note about videos, which I've encountered, is I recommend saving it to another format, because even though NVivo reads formats like MP4, that's actually just a container, and sometimes I've had the situation where NVivo will recognize the format, but it'll say, oh, there's some problems with the codec in terms of the video or the audio. So I'd just say it's good practice. It's got the capability, but probably not the best port of call for video. Some of the other things that are really helpful about collecting and organizing data in Evernote, I should say. I apologize if I'm confusing Evernote and NVivo. They sound just similar enough that I will reliably get them confused. Evernote's quite good at being supported by some other services, and one that I really like is if this then that, so IFTTT. And what that is a service that lets different web services connect to each other. So an example of this is that if you receive if something shows up on an RSS feed, if this part, then that part can be that it'll save a screenshot of that page to Evernote. So that's quite useful for automating some aspects of data collection. Of course, data collection always has to be purposeful, so I'd mention that there's some caveats around that, but it's a useful tool. And I'll just give you a sense of something that's kind of fun. I've never really had direct use for it, but I think it could be interesting in a fieldwork context, is that if this then that has an app called Do, and it just creates a big button on your phone essentially, and when you press that button it does a pre-programmed activity. So this one is, I've set the button to say, create an Evernote note with a map of my location. So I press that button once, we go to the app, open it up, and it's saved a map of where I'm located, and that's where my office is. So you can see how if you needed to just quickly grab a snapshot of where you've physically been, that's a cool little function to have. How to structure your Evernote, I think, particularly when thinking about how you're going to use and analyze it in NVivo, is quite worthwhile. I'd recommend creating a notebook for each project, largely because that makes sense to me, but it's also an easy way of importing it into NVivo, though it is important to note that you can actually import individual notes into NVivo as well. I'd also recommend tagging your data by type. So for example, this is an interview, this is literature, this is interview audio, this is notes, this is a photo. When you import these notes into NVivo, the tags can actually be brought across with you, but they're created as nodes that apply to the whole note. So that's why I think you can tag them in multiple ways, but if you tag it by your data type, that's an easy way to immediately start sorting the notes once you get them into NVivo. And it's really valuable, I find, to create notes specifically for process logs. So for example, this is what I did on this project on each date. And also a reflective journal, which is for capturing those ideas, some of your, your early concepts that are jumping out, some of the relationships you're noting, some of the early model building that you might be engaged with. They're really important way to demonstrate the credibility and, I guess, dependability of your research. And I actually like to create them not just as a way of thinking as on the go in Evernote. You can see the value of being able to do that on your phone and so on is self-evident. But also I like to bring those across sometimes and actually import them into NVivo, because sometimes I actually code some of my reflective journals to see how is this aligning with some of the concepts I've been finding and so on. So this brings us to Evernote on the go. I just wanted to give you a sense of what it's like to use this in practice. These are images of some of the places I've done qual data collection. It's not always about, the phone interviews in the office that we encounter. The best thing about Evernote for me, I find as a qual researcher, is that you're able to do your data collection as effectively in the field on a tablet as you can in your office. That might be slightly overstating it, but certainly much more so than I was in the past. I don't know about you, but I've always struggled to organise and structure data in the field. I tend to end up just thinking about the situation I actually found myself in, carrying folders full of notes and materials that you've gathered and so on, digital recorder full of files and so on. And you have to spend quite a lot of time, even if you're regimented and organised and every day go through it and, save it, back it up, make sure you're ordering things as you collect. It still can be quite onerous. This was, I think, a way forward for me, really. The best insights I often have are in the field, while you're reflecting on the interview or when you're driving from that interview to the next one. And, those insights often I was finding got missed. This enabled me to make sure that I was capturing those insights, creating quick notes, audio notes was really great. It means a lot of this concept building, concepts to check in NVivo, I was identifying them, I was doing some of the early model building, and just things to check in the data. So those notes myself were really incredibly valuable, but also I could do that and sort that as I was collecting the information in the same place. And I was starting to order and reflect my data as I went in the field much more. So that's just such a powerful capability, as I'm sure all of you as qual researchers would appreciate. The next thing to touch on is how you get your data from Evernote into NVivo. And actually, you'd expect this to be quite a complicated, lengthy part of the presentation. It's not going to be, because getting the data from Evernote into NVivo is actually quite simple. So, as you'll see from the screenshot, you select the from other sources. One of them is from EndNote. And what shows up then is there's actually two different ways of doing this. You can connect your Evernote account to NVivo, which is the top radio button that's selected. That's the easiest way, and tends to be what I do. There might be other reasons why you choose not to go down that path. You might not want to connect them and so on. So it's possible to import an Evernote export file, which is a sort of unusual looking file extension called .enex, and that works just as well. Exactly the same process. It's just a question of whether you link it to do it automatically or whether it is done based on importing that Evernote export file. And then once you bring it in, you can see these are some of the notes that were in there when I did the import. What's an important point to note is the thing that I already touched on. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a checkbox for create and code notes from Evernote tags, create nodes from Evernote tags. That's that point about, do you want the Evernote tags to be applied to the document? And if it is, it'll be applied as a node that is applied to the entire document. And actually, I find that's quite a useful way of sorting information quickly and so on. And so, yeah, that's it. That step is as complicated as it gets. So really, they work really nicely together. The trick, of course, is thinking about how you're going to analyse your information once it's in NVivo in advance, and I'll touch on that in response to some of the questions that I commonly encounter. So the most common questions I find are actually, well, I've listed them here actually. So what are the advantages of using Evernote? So I find it's practical, at least for someone like me, who has to collect a range of different types of data in different settings. And I like to do some of the preliminary sorting and organising of data in the field, because otherwise it can become a bit unmanageable and hard to make sense of often if it's been a week and then you come back to it and so on. I think also it's having all your data in one place. It doesn't matter that you left the file in the office or that it's on your work computer, not on your home computer, the situation we've all encountered. And I think the other thing to note is that it gives me multiple ways of capturing data. I'm not just reliant on the same mechanism all the time, and there's multiple ways I can access it. So those are really important advantages for me. The barriers are things like hardware requirements. So you need, for example, I think to get the most out of it, you do need some sort of mobile device, so a tablet or a phone. That's not strictly required. You need your computer. You need to be familiar and comfortable with those, using those tools. And I think you have to feel comfortable with the approach. So not everyone is. Some people like to collect their information in a different form and then bring it across in a structured way, or they like to do some of their journaling in a written journal and so on. So it's about ensuring you have, the barriers is often comfort level with the approach. So for example, I still do a lot of my journaling or reflection using pen and paper, and I actually scan it in using my phone to Evernote because of the functionality. It doesn't matter if I lose my notebook, well it does actually, but it's not the end of the world. And the other thing I like about it is it makes those handwritten notes searchable, because it's good at recognising handwriting. And I think also, it's worth thinking through, are there any data storage requirements? So, we're all doing research in settings where we require specific ethics approvals and so on, and if we haven't thought about how we address that and the use of Evernote in advance, that can be a consideration as well. One of the things I often get is, does it change the nature of the data I end up with, really? And I find for me, not really, actually. And the real difference for me has not been that it results in me collecting information I otherwise wouldn't collect, but it means that I'm sorting it earlier. I'm starting to think about some of the relationships and capturing some of those concepts earlier in the piece. So the data itself is not fundamentally different in my experience. And I think just recognising this isn't the only way to collect or sort qual data. It's just one of the ways, and I think it's that accessibility of multiple devices and the ability to generate some of those connections, or at least document some of those thoughts quickly, is really important. Can I back up my data? Well, as you would have seen with that .enex file that I mentioned about importing it into NVivo, it's possible to download your Evernote notebooks as a backup file, and I'd recommend while you're doing projects that you do that regularly. So, have your fortnightly reminder in your diary to do that and so on. Even though I've never personally encountered a problem with Evernote, but, for example, if you are trying to guard against every eventuality, which we have to do, there's nothing worse than losing your information and your data in a specific qualitative research project. I think there's some value in thinking about doing that backup process, and that's never been a problem for me, and works well, because even if there was a problem with your Evernote account, you'd still be able to import the file into NVivo. So for me, that's a useful peace of mind to have. One of the things that comes up quite a lot is data security and data privacy, as you'd appreciate. And it's always really important to consider data storage and identifiability of participants when conducting qualitative research. So because of this, you don't want people accessing your Evernote notebook. Some of the features that I think Evernote has built into it, I think actually make it more secure than other ways of collecting data. So a good example is Evernote offers two-factor authentication, so you can set it up that you need a code. Some of you might have this set up with your bank that you get SMS the code. You have a little key with a number generator that you have to enter at the same time as you log in. So that way if someone gets your password or guesses it somehow, if you set up two-factor authentication, they still won't be able to log in. So that's a really important security feature. You can also set a password on the Evernote app separate from the one on your phone. So I'd recommend doing that if you're handling sensitive data, because even if people know your phone's code, they won't be able to access the information in the app. I'd also recommend all the usual good qualitative research practices, like not including names on any notes about interviews, but having a table with linking the identifier code to a participant held in a separate secure place and so on. And really, I think it's always important to consider this approach and data security and participant confidentiality. But I actually feel confident that it would be more difficult to access my Evernote than my work network, which is quite secure anyway. So, from my perspective, there's a lot of measures you can take to really boost up security. And I think the other thing I get is, do I have to wait and start at the beginning of my next project and think about it beginning rather than can I start midway through? And I'd say you can definitely start now. You can see the input process is quite straightforward to NVivo. There's a lot of peace of mind. There's a lot of benefits to capturing some of those, I guess, analytic insights in the field to identify potential relationships to test based on your analysis in NVivo. And that you don't have to wait for your next project. You can start capturing some of that information now. And so I'd recommend getting a free account if you don't have one and see what it can do. It'll give you an idea of some of the capability and if this approach is for you. So I thought I'd just give you a sense of some tips maybe, or really these are sort of my favorite things to do when I'm using Evernote. So searching your handwriting, that example I gave, it's fantastic because it actually means that you can keep writing your notes, have them backed up, and they become rather more searchable than they were before. I'd say, as I mentioned, record your audio and video in another app and then import it into NVivo, just because it tends to work better that way and there's no risk of losing the audio, for example. One of the challenges with Evernote, I would say, particularly in relation to using Evernote and then analysing the data in NVivo, is don't collect too much data. This is always a tension for all qual research, but once you realise the range of sources of information that you can capture in Evernote, it's tempting to start treating it as your online rubbish bin. You throw everything in there. And that's actually, oddly, okay for most purposes if you use Evernote in general, because it's got good search functionality, and so you can actually find stuff quite well. It's not so good for NVivo, though, because you end up with simply just too much information to code and think about. So I think, as always with qual research, make sure you're collecting your data purposefully and have a sense of how you're going to use it to answer your question. I think capture your ideas. This has been the real benefit for me, is don't be afraid to document all your tiny little ideas as you go. And even though I've mentioned it's easy to end up with too much data, the sort of stuff you can end up with too much of is actually more literature or background information, websites that you've clicked, not the stuff that is to do with your thoughts or your interpretations or your synthesis. That's not the information you end up with too much of. That's the real value of this approach. So make sure you're capturing your ideas. And I'd say also avoid re-importing your data from Evernote to NVivo. So an inductive approach is great, but it doesn't work so well if you want to constantly switch back and forth. That it's possible to bring across new sources into NVivo, but don't imagine you're going to bring across all the information that you've already imported. So I would recommend, where possible, drawing a line on the data that you import into NVivo, bring across new information, but don't constantly keep changing or tweaking notes in NVivo and then bring it across to Evernote, it can just create problems. Version control can be a challenge and so on. And so I think plan it where you can. Keep your data collection distinct, or at least make sure you're not bringing across the same notes or different versions of notes. That can be easier said than done, particularly if you're doing an ongoing piece of work like an ethnography or a grounded theory study. So I often treat it as two distinct project phases. The background research when I'm looking at the literature, reports, or I try to identify specific data collection methods. And I'll actually often bring that into NVivo if I think there'd be value in making sense of it or developing a conceptual framework. I often bring that information into NVivo to do that. But then when you're doing your primary data collection, treat that as a distinct phase and bring that information across separately if possible. So they're really my main tips. I think I just wanted to reiterate what we've covered. The basics of using Evernote, how you collect and organise your data in Evernote in a way that will make sense to then analyse it in NVivo. Using it on the go, and I think that's really where the value of it comes in. How to get your data from Evernote into NVivo, which is surprisingly simple. Common questions people tend to have and my tips. Here are some good resources. So I mentioned that there was this webinar last year which covers similar territory, and it's really worth reading. There's a blog post that went with it. And what's interesting is that some of the functionality that I've touched on, like the really enhanced search for text within handwritten notes and so on, has really come a long way in the past year. So Evernote's more and more useful. NVivo is becoming more and more useful for talking together, but also for the kind of data collection and analysis we're talking about. You can access these slides at that address if you'd like, and of course some of the things that I've mentioned are, of course, the QSR site for NVivo, Evernote website, and if this then that. So those are my contact details, and thanks very much for your time so far. That's what I'd hope to cover and present on, but I'm hoping some of you will have some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben. That was fantastic. I didn't realise there was you could use Evernote for so many things. We do have a couple of questions. One's coming from Sunita, who asks, what about getting data from NVivo to Evernote? Do you ever do that? Would there ever be a time when you'd like to take something back out of NVivo and put it into Evernote?
That's a good question, Sunita. From my perspective, I tend not to do that, just because for me, I do the analysis, then I start my write-up. Now, sometimes it is possible to actually do aspects of your write-up in Evernote, and that's quite useful, being accessible and so on, but it's just not how I tend to approach it. That being said, sometimes if I've done things like matrix queries or drawn models, often I will actually take a screenshot of that and save it as an image into my Evernote library, Evernote notebook on that project. So I wouldn't generally import the whole project back into Evernote, but there are occasions where some of the insights I get from NVivo, I want to make sure I've got filed away in my Evernote as well.
Okay. Okay, some questions are starting to come in now. So we welcome questions. How much time have we got for questions? About 20 minutes, so you've got plenty of time if you're keen to ask a question for Ben. Okay. Oh, here they all come. Okay, so Rajesh, I can answer your question. He's asking whether we can import from Evernote into NVivo for Mac. Not at this stage. It's only available for the Windows, on the Windows platform.
Though I would just add, because I am an NVivo for Mac user as well, yeah, if you can get access to the Windows machine to do that,
yes,
then save it for Mac version.
That's
that works
right.
Fine.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, good, you've done that. Good, okay.
Okay.
Belinda saying that she uses OneNote, and she sort of lost you a bit when you were discussing the differences between OneNote OneNote and Evernote?
Yeah, so there's a lot of similar functionality. I would say they're complementary. I actually would, it's more a question often of the benefits of OneNote is that they're really well integrated into the Microsoft Office ecosystem. So depending on how you work and how you want to collect things, it works well. Evernote, I think some of the differences are the range of platforms it's available on, like, you know, for example, the Android apps are a little bit more, I think, sophisticated, it would be fair to say, but they're very complementary, and there's not necessarily a massive difference in the type of function they can serve. There are differences in specific features.
Mm. But I think the important thing is that, yes, Linda, we can bring OneNote data into NVivo. Yeah.
Yeah, it just tends to be that I don't use it myself, but they're very similar.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, we've answered Jennifer's question there. So you got that, Jennifer, about importing Evernote to NVivo for Mac. So how Ben works, there's a lot of Mac people out there that might be using actually both platforms. So how Ben works is that he brings it in through the Windows side and then converts it to Mac. There's a few people who have been asking about whether there's a recording of this session. Yes, there is. We have been recording it, and that will get sent to you sometime next week. So you'll be able to have that to review that recording again. Okay. Oh, yes. We have a question. So Evernote doesn't do the analysis like NVivo does.
Absolutely not. Unfortunately, Evernote, like NVivo, doesn't have an analyze this for me button.
No, no.
You know, it's you know, for me the way I see the difference is Evernote's really useful for capturing ideas and the data in the field in particular. NVivo is just the absolute workhorse in terms of the analysis.
That's right.
And once you're in the project, you know, making sure that you're capturing some of the information that can inform your analysis, I think, is an important aspect of it. Of Evernote, it doesn't really do any of the analysis for you. So that's really where NVivo, no one else comes close.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, and they're both tools. They're both, and you know, they're both tools. Yeah, I remember doing some work with someone a long, long time ago, and the way that this person, she was doing her PhD many years ago, and the way she used to talk about NVivo, her PhD supervisor actually thought that NVivo was a person. It was kind of walked through the door. Okay. Okay. Melissa just wants a little bit more clarity on the free version of Evernote, the differences.
Yeah.
You know, do you think the free version is, you know, is that sufficient for what most people would need?
It depends a little bit, and the thing that I would say is probably the deal breaker on what tipped me over and to start paying for it was I recognised that a lot of the value from Evernote came from being able to attach things to it. If you treat it solely as a note-taking approach, the free version will be fine, and it'll have enough allowance in terms of what you're allowed to upload. I can't recall what the bandwidth you're allocated is, but I think in the free version you're limited to 60 or 100 megabytes a month. That might have changed. They are constantly tweaking features and so on. But when I realized, oh, hang on, if I could just put the data and my notes into the single note, that's just useful. And it meant that, okay, I could get, you know, 3 or 4 interviews within my monthly allowance and so on. But, you know, when I was tipping over into more than that, when I was saving lots of PDFs and reports, for example, that's really the tipping point for me. There are some specific functions and functionality that you're enabled to have with the paid subscription version, but I emphasize I'm not, even though I sound like it, I'm not actually an Evernote salesman. Some of the things you can get are a presenting function, so it turns your notes into something that's a little bit more screen friendly, for example, if you want to present information to others, those sorts of things. So it's got a range of features, but really for our purposes the main difference is the amount of is the size of the attachments that you can include within a month, and then of course getting those into NVivo. But if you're thinking I just want to focus on text, for example, or my written notes, yeah, the free version is sufficient for that. It's really just thinking through, you know, how many bits of audio will I be bringing across, what's the size of those. So.
Well, I guess you could give it a go, Melissa, anyway. If you found that it wasn't sufficient, you know, you could then look at perhaps giving it, you know, purchasing it. Actually, Paul's mentioned, Paul, one of our participants, says that he thinks the free version doesn't allow offline access.
That is accurate. That's true, actually.
Yeah.
So you do need to have a connection.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, there's been a few training questions as well that but this session, as people who've joined us probably realise, it wasn't a training session. We do offer training courses. So it was just having Ben present to us how he's used Evernote and NVivo together. Not so much, you know, how you do it by all the different clicks that you have to go through. Oh, okay. I don't know whether you can answer this one, Ben. I'll give it a go. Rajesh asks, can you give some more examples of IFTTT use in qual research?
Okay. All right. No, that's good. So IFTTT, that if this then that service, is quite useful in specific use cases. I showed that button, for example, which is, they call it the Do app. So you press the button, it does something. So in that case, it created an Evernote note with a map of your location and at the time. You can set that button and create what they term recipes, but they're essentially, you know, like instructions to do different things. So one of the other things you could do is create a quick note with the Note app function that they've got. They've also got a function that lets you take in a photo and have that automatically sent to your Evernote and so on. So that's the sort of things that you can do with the app on your phone. On your desktop, you can set up some other, and you can do this on the phone as well. They're just more mobile-friendly uses. Another example is it's quite good at doing things like monitoring RSS feeds, or, you know, if you do something on another service that recognises that and can create information in Evernote. So an example would be, I might be interested in a blog that publishes irregularly on a specific topic that might be aligned with my research. I can set up a recipe so that it looks at that RSS feed, and when there's a new post, it might save it to my Evernote, or it could save it even as a PDF to your Evernote. Another example might be is if you use another service like for offline reading. Some of you might use something like Instapaper or Pocket. You can set it so that if you are a user of those apps or services, when you're reading something and you either star it or favourite, whatever their terminology is, it automatically saves it to your Evernote as well. So you can see it's just a way of getting those online services to talk to each other. The only thing I would caution against is that issue that I alluded to of dumping everything in Evernote, because you do have to think ultimately, particularly as it relates to NVivo, I am going to have to code and sort through this at some stage. So it's good for automating things, just be wary about the volume of automated functions you want to set up.
Okay, Ben, thank you for that. I'm just looking at some more. Okay, I've got a few thank yous that have come in here. Oh, and then someone's actually given us details, Xander, on how to sign up for the free Evernote free sign up. If people want to try Evernote with the paid functions, okay. Oh, okay, Erica, I'm just looking at the clock. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Erica's asking, she's interested in knowing more about the scanning function in Evernote, and once taken into NVivo, can you code individual sentences? Also, how do you export multiple photos at once from Evernote?
Yeah, so the scanning function is not something that, to my knowledge, is built into NVivo. That sort of scanning and so on is built into Evernote. So it's really useful for sorting and organising in Evernote, but don't have the expectation that that information is brought across hard-coded. So that's a really important point to note. And why I would actually say avoid using handwritten notes for things that you know you absolutely will have to code specific sections and phrases of, ultimately for exactly that purpose. But if you're someone who does a lot of your journaling and your reflection and so on in handwritten format already, go for it. But I think, you know, some of the other things that can be brought across and coded and analysed in NVivo, such as PDFs, they work well as long as they're those PDFs that were created from the document and not necessarily just a photo or a scan, you know, a photocopy, a scan of that document. So in terms of embedded PDFs in Evernote, that comes across well. Don't expect that the scanning handwritten search function will bring that information across. The other thing to mention in terms of how do you bring images across, so they're embedded within the notes. They're brought across as media when you bring them into NVivo, and it does bring across multiples from memory. I haven't done this, I haven't checked that for today's session. From memory, I've never had any problems where there's, for example, 2 photos attached to a note and that gets brought across to NVivo. So that comes across well. But I think, yeah, just that caveat that the sorting handwritten stuff is really useful and it's a neat little trick, but don't expect that you'll be able to do that in the NVivo side.
Just the final question from Paul, is there a way that you can just partially export some of the data out of Evernote for importing into NVivo?
Yeah, great question. So you can actually select, the example I gave was bringing across a whole notebook, which works quite well, but you can actually select individual notes. And so that's a really good question, and it is possible to bring across individual notes. It's just that there's a little bit more. The process is the same, you just have to tick individual notes. And I guess the thing that I'd mention is just when you're doing that to make sure that the notes have good descriptions, because otherwise it's really hard if the notes don't have good titles to figure out which ones you want to bring across.
Okay, well that's, thanks very much for taking the time again, Ben. A great presentation and answering all those questions. Thank you very much everyone for joining us. So anyone, I'll just take back the presenter right so I can just show this final slide, Ben.
Of course.
If anyone's looking for further information, you're on your slide deck you gave the Evernote and also the QSR slide, but there's also lots of other information. I get to the, okay, just let me, I was just going to look at something else here. Hang on a second, I've just got the other slide going instead of the one I actually really did want to show you. So the, just show my screen again. Oh, gone back to the wrong one. Okay, what I was going to send to everybody was a list of all the places you can go on the QSR website for further information. So we'll pop all that into an email as well. QSR's got, there's a huge, people who will have been on the QSR website, there's a huge amount of information there. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we've got a LinkedIn group. We've got the support team. We run a lot of different types of courses ranging from online courses, which are very cheap, self-paced courses, very inexpensive rather, I shouldn't say cheap. And then we run our face-to-face workshops. So just giving our training a bit of a plug there, Ben. But yes, we'll put that all into an email and people will get that sometime next week with a copy of the recording. So thank you again, Ben, for taking the time to present this, and thank you to all the people who joined. We had quite a big group here, so I'm sure they all found it interesting by all the thank yous that I can see on that question panel. So look out for more of these eSeminars. We're running these quite regularly now. not only in Asia Pacific, but we also run them in the Americas time zone. So if you happen to be a late night worker, you can certainly join in one of those. So just go to our website and see the ones that are upcoming. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you again, Ben.
Thanks very much.
Okay, bye for now.